Asura's Wrath is a complicated case. It has many problems and yet still ends up being an enjoyable experience for most players. I've certainly enjoyed it for the most part. The problems of the game, however, are many and quite complex. Its biggest one is how it was butchered by Capcom. The game is divided into episodes similarly to how a TV show would be structured. You even get some narration about the next episode as you would in some TV shows. However, some of the episodes are straight out missing from the core game. That is quite important because these are necessary if you want to follow the story properly. The story is missing 2 episodes from its second act and the whole third act altogether, meaning that the real ending of the game and conclusion of the story is hidden behind a paywall. That's right, Capcom decided to demand money for core content by disguising it as a DLC. This is yet another example of the deplorable anti-consumer tactics we see nowadays by big name publishers, and it's completely unacceptable. The issue is all the more painful when you realize that Asura's Wrath is barely a game if you look at it gameplay wise. It's actually more of a cinematic experience resembling a Telltale game or to some extent Heavy Rain. The gameplay is very repetitive and quite boring. It's one giant quick-time event with the occasional beat-em-up segment. If you've read anything about the game on a forum or anywhere on the internet, you will see that people mostly talk about how the gameplay is shit and the story is the real reason to play the game. I felt the same way and therefore had to pay $15 on top of the original price of the game in order to access the full core story plus the 2 extra lost episodes. This is also the main reason why the game was not very successful in commercial terms and will not have any sequels. But let's go about it one step at a time, shall we? Let's start with the gameplay, the weakest point of the game. It goes something like this. Usually a cutscene introduces the player to what is happening, and then you have to either mindlessly hold the fire button because it's one of those sections where you just fire, or you have to mash 2 buttons until a gauge is full and you can activate your special move, which will usually require you to follow up with a few quick time events. This is it. After that, another cutscene will play, showing you the result of your actions. We've seen this many times before, but what makes this game worse than most others is that in many cases missing a QTE prompt won't have any negative effect besides earning you a lower end score for the level. In most games, missing a QuickTime event rewards you with some kind of feedback, letting you know you have failed. For example, you will have to try to avoid something from hitting you, miss the QuickTime event prompt, and you see your character take a hit instead of evading. That's a pretty good generic example. However, in Asura's Wrath, things kind of just go on without you. I think there are only a few instances in the game where missing a QuickTime event deals a negative consequence for the character, and that's not visually represented by any way but the game over screen. No scenes where he dies or takes a hit or anything. So there are either the possibilities where nothing happens, you miss it, and the game just goes on as if you hit it, or you just get suddenly a game over screen because the game really wants you to hit that one for whatever reason. In other words, it's more like a movie that mostly doesn't really care about your participation. This puts it in the category of other similar games such as the Telltale ones, but even there you are required to participate a bit more often and a bit more actively. In games like Heavy Rain, for example, the story can actually change quite significantly based on you missing some of the QuickTime events. This means that Asura's Wrath is the absolute bottom when it comes to gameplay, and it's questionable if it's fair to even call it a game because of that. However, it does have one redeeming quality, and that is the story. So let's talk about the story a bit. It's objectively unoriginal and feels like the first act is rushed quite a bit. Asura is a betrayed demigod who has his wife murdered and his daughter abducted by the other demigods. It's a revenge story. The wife's death happens minutes after we are introduced to her, and so the player feels nothing for that loss. The daughter is also abducted minutes after we are introduced to her as well, so you see there's no emotional attachment to these characters at this point. The story seems cheesy and simple at first. The fact that Asura is mostly a one-dimensional character defined by his rage doesn't really help that. I won't lie to you, this game clearly is aimed at a male fanbase. The idea of rescuing your family or taking vengeance and killing all who have wronged you, the ideas of camaraderie and rivalry, the fact that the angrier Asura becomes, the more power he gains, all these cater to things that males, me included, view as desirable traits and roles. In our modern age, we see women portrayed more and more often in that role as well. A good example would be the Kill Bill movies, but there are of course others. And altogether, I just find it harder to accept that a woman can defeat 10 men in hand-to-hand combat or anything like that than when I see a man. Objectively, that's probably impossible for a man to do as well, but it just requires me to go a bit further to buy into it when I see a woman. Asura's story takes him on a journey which lasts thousands of years. This serves to show that not even extreme lengths of time will lessen his fury. If anything, his wrath only grows stronger. We follow him as he takes out one old acquaintance after another. Nothing can stop him, no amount of enemies. And the best part is that for the most of the game, you feel overpowered. This is not the journey of someone who is weak and then becomes strong. It's the journey of someone who is really strong into becoming a monster. And while the story may sound quite simple, it has a few twists and turns which I don't want to spoil here. Let's just say that not all of Asura's targets are his enemies, and not all of his allies are his friends. It's ultimately an entertaining story and well worth experiencing, but only if you can afford to buy the DLC. And speaking of DLC, let's talk about that for a bit. First, there are 2 short episodes which give you details on what happened between some of the core games episodes. They are not that important, but do fill in story holes which would otherwise really disturb the player. The thing that is common between these 2 DLCs is that they are animated and drawn very poorly and look nothing like the rest of the game. It feels like a blatant cash grab, and clearly no love or real effort was put into them. You get absolutely no gameplay there unless you count very simple QTEs as such, and this is one of those cases where failing the QTEs again has no negative effect on it. Then you have the last 4 episodes of the game which conclude the actual story and offer the most in terms of character development. All 4 episodes are one DLC and can provide, and when I'm talking about 4 episodes, I mean the last 4 that I just mentioned, not the 2 ones in between. So all of them are actually one DLC and provide the last chapter of the game, while all other DLCs go for $2 a piece because they're really small and short. This one costs $7 and is the only one really worth buying. The episodes are interesting and an absolute must-have if you wish to play this game. You will literally not get the end of the game if you don't do this. They have the same quality as the rest of the core game, and when it comes to bosses, I'd argue the quality is even higher. The last 2 individual DLCs are known as the Lost Episodes. Those are spin-offs in which Asura faces off against Ryu first and then Akuma from Street Fighter. In those episodes, you get a minor gameplay change at first, in which the game moves into a Street Fighter-like 2D perspective, and you get to fight some like that, but the moveset is extremely limited, so it's not really more than a gimmick. The problem is that those 2 episodes have no story attached to them, so you're essentially buying 2 episodes based on the weakest aspect of the game, its gameplay. I don't recommend it. Something that I find quite impressive is how the game looks, considering that it runs on previous generation consoles. I've played it on the PlayStation 3 and must say that it definitely pushes the system to its limits. There were only 2 occasions where I've noticed a dip in the frame rates, but other than that it ran smoothly and looked great all over when you consider everything else, and especially the hardware. The voice acting is excellent in both Japanese and English, and you can choose whichever dub you like for all episodes except the Lost ones. Those DLC episodes only come in Japanese. I'm both sad and angry about the fact that the game will see no sequels, because despite all of its flaws, I ended up enjoying it and would have liked to see another Asura's game. In many ways, it's like a Dragon Ball game with a more mature audience in mind. It's more brutal, more visceral, and without going too far over the top. But that is also what had to happen. If the consumers don't punish these foul practices of butchering games and selling us all the parts separately, then we will fall victims to this more and more often over time. So would you try Asura's Wrath? Well, that depends on, I guess, if you are willing to pay for the DLCs, because the gameplay is not something worth playing. The way I see it, the story progression after every mission is the player's reward for putting up with the bland gameplay. So if that seems like asking too much, then you better stay away from it. But on the other hand, if you enjoy stories like the ones in Dragon Ball, this is definitely a must play for you. Just don't forget to get the story DLC with the last 4 episodes. This is the most important one, otherwise you'll just be missing out on core content. Thanks for watching and have a great day.